Talking to the ceiling. Chapter 1. The incident with the telephone. The phone was mocking me. I was fairly certain of this. It sat there on the kitchen table. This thin, glossy rectangle that my granddaughter Rosie had pressed into my hands last Christmas with the words, "It's easy, Grandpa, you'll love it." Rosie is 23 and believes everything is easy. She also believes avocado belongs on toast, which tells you something about the reliability of her judgment. It was a Wednesday evening in October. That particular kind of damp, grey Wednesday that feels like England has given up trying. And I was attempting, for the third time that week, to video call Rosie in Edinburgh. She'd been up there for her graduate studies, and while I was proud of her to the point of embarrassing myself at the butcher's, I did miss her face. My name is Arthur Pembridge. I'm 72 years old. I spent 35 years as a secondary school woodworking teacher. I make a very good shepherd's pie, and I am, as of this writing, apparently famous on something called TikTok. I want to be clear. I did not intend any of it. It started with the buttons. There were too many of them. I had already accidentally ordered a large bag of cat food from the internet. I don't own a cat. Reorganized my phone's entire language to Latvian, and this one I'm still not entirely sure how. Somehow unsubscribed from my own email address. So the evening's failures were, strictly speaking, not without precedent. I found Rosie in my contacts. I pressed the little camera icon because that seemed logical, and then I must have pressed something else, because a red banner appeared at the top with the words, "You are now live." I stared at it. Now I want to emphasize. I did not know what live meant in this context. I assumed it was perhaps a confirmation that the call was connecting. That is, live as opposed to dead, which in my experience of this phone was far more likely. I turned the camera toward the ceiling while I looked for my glasses, found them on top of my head, and then looked back at the screen. There were 14 people watching me. I don't mind telling you I let out a noise that was not entirely dignified. "Hello," I said, to what I now understood was a live audience of strangers. "Is anyone there? Can you hear me?" I was trying to ring my granddaughter. The little comments began appearing at the bottom of the screen. Small bubbles of text racing upward. "OMG, who is this man?" And, "Hello sir." And one that simply read, "King," which I assumed was either a compliment or someone had typed the wrong window. There were now 43 people watching. "Right," I said, because I couldn't find a way to stop it and my reading glasses had slid down my nose again. "Well, I'm here, apparently. I suppose I'll just..." I was going to fix the hinge on the understairs cupboard door, actually. It's been squeaking for 3 weeks and it's beginning to get on my nerves. I don't suppose any of you know about door hinges? There were 91 people watching. Chapter 2. The squeaky hinge and other matters. I talked for an hour. I'm not sure how else to explain it. I'd meant to say a quick sorry, goodbye, and good evening, but something about the little comments kept me going. They were so eager, these strangers in my phone. There was a young man from Texas who said he'd always wanted to know how to fix a hinge. A girl in South Korea who typed, in slightly uncertain English, "My door also squeaks, please help." Someone from Manchester who claimed they were an adult and still didn't own a screwdriver, which I found alarming. So I showed them. I fetched my toolbox from the hall cupboard. The one that had belonged to my father, dented and green and smelling of linseed oil. And I brought it back to the kitchen table and talked them through it. Proper hinges, I explained. How to identify whether the squeak is the hinge pin or the wood settling. How to remove the hinge cleanly. The merit of using petroleum jelly over WD-40 in a domestic setting. Margaret always said I over-explain things. I told the camera, with a hinge pin in one hand and a rag in the other. She was probably right. She usually was, on matters of that sort. The comments went very quiet for a moment after I said that. Then someone typed, "Who's Margaret?" And I suppose that's where the evening took a different sort of turn. "My wife," I said. "She passed away 2 years ago. Breast cancer. She was 69. I paused, because I'd said it out loud and it still did the same thing to my chest it always did. Like someone had put a hand on it and pressed, gently but firmly. Daft woman had been going to the doctor less often as she got older. I used to say, "Margaret, you go to the car mechanic for a service, you ought to treat yourself the same way." She said I was comparing her to a Ford Mondeo. I could see the heart emojis appearing on screen, hundreds of them, floating upward like soap bubbles. She was the one who made this house feel full. I said. It's funny, isn't it, how a house can be exactly the same size as it always was but feel twice as large when someone's not in it. I hadn't planned to say any of that. I'd meant to talk about petroleum jelly and Hinge alignment. But there it was. When I finally managed to find the right button and end the live stream. By complete accident, I assure you, I pressed what I thought was the volume. I sat back in my kitchen chair and ate the cold corner of a cheese sandwich I'd abandoned an hour earlier, and felt, peculiarly, rather better than I had in some time. By morning, Rosie was ringing me. "Grandpa," she said. There was a sound in her voice I recognized. It was the sound of her trying not to laugh. "You've got 1 million views." I looked at her face in the little screen. "I'm sorry. 1 million people have watched your video." I considered this. "Well," I said. "I expect they were curious about the Hinge. I lost my granddad last year and this man just made me cry in a Burger King. I don't even know his name and I love him." At SophiaServants_NYC. 847,000 likes. Chapter 3. Going viral. Whatever that means. Rosie drove down from Edinburgh the following weekend, which told me she was either very worried or very excited, and given that she arrived with a bag of croissants and an expression like Christmas morning, I concluded it was the latter. She sat at the kitchen table and showed me the comments. There were hundreds of thousands of them. Not just the Hinge business. People had stayed for Margaret, apparently. There was a young woman called Priya in Toronto who had lost her own grandfather 6 months ago, and written 3 long paragraphs which I could barely read without my glasses going misty for unrelated reasons. A 20-year-old student in Dublin who said nobody in his life had ever talked to him the way I talked to the camera. A man of 35 from Auckland who said he'd called his estranged father after watching the video, and they'd talked for the first time in 4 years. "Grandpa," said Rosie, very carefully, the way you might approach a cat that could go either way. "I think you should keep doing it. Making videos. You're like. People are calling you a digital grandfather." I tried the phrase out in my head. Digital grandfather. I was a man who still wrote birthday cards by hand and bought stamps from the post office rather than online, because I felt the post office deserved the support. "That sounds like the title of a science fiction film," I said. "It's a compliment. I'm aware. I'm just not sure I'm qualified. You talked about a Hinge for 20 minutes and then made half the internet cry with your feelings. You're absolutely qualified." She set the phone up on a little stand. She bought a stand, which suggested this had been planned well in advance of any consultation with me, and showed me how to press the correct button to go live on purpose, rather than by catastrophic accident. She made me practice 3 times. The 3rd time, I accidentally ordered the cat food again. We agreed not to mention this. That Saturday afternoon, I went live on purpose for the first time. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and I said, "Good afternoon. I'm Arthur. I don't entirely understand what I'm doing here, but apparently neither does anyone else, so we should get along fine." Within 5 minutes, 8,000 people were watching. I made a Victoria sponge. I talked, while I made it, about how Margaret had taught me to bake. She'd said that a man who couldn't feed himself was a man who was always dependent on the goodwill of others, which she felt was a precarious way to live. I told them about the time I'd put salt in the sponge instead of sugar and we'd served it to her sister, June, who'd eaten 2 slices without comment because she was too polite to say anything, and we'd only discovered the error when we'd tasted it ourselves and Margaret had laughed until she had to sit down. By the end, I had 42,000 followers. She made a sound that I can only describe as a squeal, which I felt was a slight overreaction, but I let her have it. The following Tuesday, I taught them how to bleed a radiator. The Tuesday after that, we talked about loneliness. Not in a mournful way, I want to be clear, but in the frank, practical way that I'd always found more useful than tiptoeing round a subject. I told them, loneliness isn't a character flaw. It's a weather condition. It passes. You can do things while you wait for it to pass. That one got 12 million views. I found out about it when my postman knocked on the door to tell me his daughter had sent him the clip. He stayed for tea. We talked about allotments. My therapist asked me what's been helping lately, and I said, an elderly English man talking about his radiator, and she looked at me for a very long time. At Hal_in_Ohio, 2.1 M likes. Chapter 4. The letters. By November, Rosie had set up something she called a fan mail address. I didn't love the phrase fan mail. It conjured images of pop stars and screaming teenagers, which seemed a long way from a retired woodworking teacher with a Victoria sponge. But I couldn't argue with what arrived. The messages came through the email, which I'd largely mastered by this point, though I still held a private suspicion of it. There were hundreds. Then thousands. Rosie printed the best ones out and brought them down every other weekend, and we'd read them together at the kitchen table with tea, which I found to be the correct way to receive most things in life. There was a young man named Daniel, 22, from somewhere in the American Midwest, who had written me 4 pages. He was the first person in his family to go to university, he said, and he didn't know anyone who'd been before him, and sometimes he felt as though he was doing everything for the first time with no map. He'd watched my Hinge video on a sleepless night, and then fallen down a rabbit hole of all the subsequent videos, and he said, and this is the part that I had to stop and put my cup of tea down for. He said I reminded him of what a grandfather might be like, if he'd had one who was around. His grandfather, it emerged, had died before Daniel was born. He'd grown up watching his friends visit their grandparents, and had never quite known how to explain that it was a specific kind of absence. Not grief, exactly, but a gap. A door with no house behind it. I don't know if you'll read this. He'd written. But if you do, thank you for talking to the ceiling. My ceiling thanks you too. I wrote back. This took me the better part of an afternoon, and involved 3 drafts and Rosie reading it over to make sure I hadn't accidentally written anything odd, which was a reasonable precaution given recent history. I told him, the map is overrated. Most of the best places I've ever found, I found by not knowing where I was going. I told him about the first year of teaching, when I'd been 24 and the boys had been 15 and the gap in authority had felt laughable. How I'd been terrified most mornings, and had stood at the front of the room and decided that if I was going to be terrified, I might as well be terrified while showing someone something useful. 40 odd years later, I still thought that was a reasonable approach to most problems. He wrote back within the day. Then again the following week. By Christmas he'd sent me a photograph of a small wooden shelf he'd built himself. His first attempt, a bit crooked but absolutely structurally sound. After watching my joinery video, he'd put it above his desk. On it, he'd placed a photograph of his late grandfather. I kept that email. I printed it and put it in the kitchen drawer, next to a photograph of Margaret and a good recipe for leek soup that I kept meaning to try. There were others. So many others. a 19-year-old girl in Melbourne called Jess who was severely anxious and had started watching my videos to help her fall asleep. Not because they were boring, she was very keen to establish, but because the sound of my voice was, in her words, like a fireplace. A retired nurse in Jamaica who was now 58, and had recently lost her own husband, and said watching me talk about Margaret had made her feel less peculiar about talking to her husband's empty armchair, which she'd been doing and feeling embarrassed about. A pair of teenage boys in Edinburgh, not far from Rosie, it turned out, who had apparently been using my woodworking videos to build a treehouse in their garden, and wrote to ask whether I thought they ought to use Phillips or flathead screws for the decking planks. I wrote back to all of them. It took me a while. I'm not a fast typist. I use 2 fingers and I look at the keyboard, which Rosie finds unbearable to watch. But I wrote to all of them. It seemed the right thing to do. Margaret would have done the same. She had always been the sort of person who wrote back. When people sent Christmas cards, she sent Christmas cards. When people needed something, she brought a casserole and sat down and listened. She had an extraordinary capacity for making people feel that they had her full attention, which they did, because she was genuinely interested in people, all people, in a way that I had always quietly admired and never quite managed to replicate. I thought, doing all this replying and reading and thinking, that perhaps this was the closest I'd come to understanding what she'd been doing all along. POV. You're a lonely 20-something who found their grandpa on TikTok by accident, and now your whole week is structured around his upload schedule. At Vexley Marchetti. 4.7 M likes. Chapter 5. What the ceiling knows. It is now March. I have 4,060,something thousand followers on TikTok. I'm told this is a significant number. Rosie bounces slightly on her heels when she says it, which is her version of losing composure entirely. My Tuesday afternoon sessions have become a sort of institution, apparently. I know this because a young journalist rang the house phone. The actual house phone, which I keep to be contrary, and asked if she could do an interview for a newspaper. I said I'd think about it. I haven't yet thought about it. I'm going to think about it in my own time, which is to say never, or possibly quite soon, depending on whether Rosie applies sufficient pressure at the next available opportunity. Last Tuesday I talked about grief. Proper grief, the long kind. Not the first terrible months, which everyone talks about, but the quieter grief that comes 2 years on, when everyone stopped asking and you're meant to be better, and you mostly are, but then you reach for something at the back of a kitchen drawer, and find a grocery list in your wife's handwriting, and you stand in the kitchen for quite a while holding it. I was not planning to say any of that. I was planning to talk about regrouting bathroom tiles. But there it was. Out it came. The comments afterward were unlike anything I'd seen before. Hundreds of thousands of people describing their own version of the drawer, the handwriting, the standing still. A woman in Chicago who found a voicemail from her mother she'd been saving for years and still couldn't quite bring herself to delete. A man in Portugal who had kept his father's reading glasses in his jacket pocket for 3 years and said they were the last thing he touched before he went to sleep. I read every one that I could. Not because I had a plan. Just because it seemed like the sort of thing that ought to be done. What I've learned, in these 5 months of accidentally becoming a fixture in strangers' lives, is this. Loneliness is extraordinarily common and almost nobody talks about it properly. Young people are lonely in a particular way that nobody prepared them for. They are more connected than any generation in history, and somehow more isolated, and the gap between those two things is where the trouble lives. They can reach anyone on earth in 30 seconds and yet will go weeks without a real conversation. They have hundreds of people watching their lives and nobody asking how they actually are. I am just an old man who talks to a ceiling-facing camera about hinges and sponge cake and the woman he misses every morning when he boils the kettle for 1 cup instead of 2. I don't have qualifications for this. I have a toolbox and a good shepherd's pie recipe and 72 years of making mistakes and occasionally learning from them. And apparently that's enough. Or if not enough, it's at least something. I'm not sure I expected, at this stage of life, to be something. The understairs cupboard door no longer squeaks, incidentally. Fixed it that same October evening, while 400,000 people watched. The hinge pin just needed cleaning and a bit of petroleum jelly. Takes about 10 minutes, once you know what you're doing. Most things do. Daniel, the young man from America, the one without a map, sent me a message on Christmas Eve. He'd called his mother, he said, and told her about his year. He'd told her about the shelf. He'd told her he was grateful, which he hadn't managed to say out loud in a while. She'd cried a bit. He'd found it easier than expected. He said, "I think I've been missing the point of the map. The point isn't to know where you're going. It's to know someone else has been lost before you and come out the other side." I sat with that for a little while. Then I wrote back, "That's exactly it. You've got it exactly." Rosie came for Christmas, and her friend Preeti, and my neighbor Gerald, who had nobody to go to, and we ate too much and pulled crackers and wore paper hats, and at some point in the afternoon I looked around the table and thought, this house doesn't feel quite so large today. On Boxing Day morning, I went live while making porridge. 600,000 people watched me stir a pan. Someone asked if they should add salt or sugar. I said, both actually, a very small amount of each, and you might think that sounds wrong, but try it, trust me. Dozens of comments immediately said they were getting up to try it right now. I think Margaret would have found the whole thing absolutely hilarious. I think she'd have made me put on a better jumper for the camera. I think she'd have leaned in the doorway and watched and said something dry and perfect that I'd have laughed at despite myself. I think, when I'm talking to that camera, I'm also talking to her. And I think some small part of her is somehow, in all those comments and messages and replied to emails, talking back. Next Tuesday I'm going to teach everyone how to replace a tap washer. It's easy once you know how. Most things are.